Hey, my name's Brendan. Welcome to Highlands Online. If you're a regular here, or if this is your first time, you're so welcome and we're glad you're with us. We'd love to hear from you on our Facebook or Instagram or our website if you've got questions or prayer requests, or if you just want to say hey. We'd love to hear from you. We hope you enjoyed today's message.
I just wanted to pray before we get into the word this morning because it's morphed a few times over that period, but I really believe it's something that God has that he wants to speak to us about today. So will you join with me and pray this morning? Lord, we just thank you for who you are, for what you are doing in this place, what you're doing in our lives. Lord, this morning we come ready to hear from you. Father, I pray that today it would be less of me, it would be less of us and more of you. Teach us what you want to teach us. Show us what you want us to see, and not in others, but in ourselves, and help us to know you more. Father, thank you for always loving us, for never giving up on us, for always pursuing us with your grace and your mercy and your love. Amen. Hey, so there's something really comforting in never achieving your potential. If you think about it, if you never get what you want, you've always got something to aim for, right? It's like the carrot on a stick. You never lose your motivation because it always remains in front of you. And of course, I'm being facetious this morning, but it's this thought that's kind of just arrested me lately. See, don't you love it when God starts doing something in you and he kind of points things out in your life that you don't really want him to point out, and you weren't aware of it, but then you become aware of it and you kind of can't ignore it. It becomes this crossroad moment where you're like, well, I've got to make a decision. I can ignore it. I can choose to do nothing, but I can't ignore it. I can't go forward and be the same because now that I'm aware of it, it's always going to be there. And so I was reflecting on this idea that sometimes we get satisfied in our own dissatisfaction, that we're comfortable in our own discomfort, and that sometimes we choose to live in a place that we were never meant to live in. And so while I was kind of researching this and thinking about it, I came across this body of work, and it's actually something that I think we'd all be familiar with, but I think it may perhaps just be the greatest treatise on the human condition, on love and of loss and of tragedy and of hope that probably ever graced our TV screens. And of course you know it. It's something that I've watched and I've been profoundly impacted by. And I'm sure you have too. And you're probably ahead of me, you probably already know what I'm talking about. But I am, of course, talking about the story of Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. See, it's this fascinating insight into the human condition. And stay with me on this. But I think it's perfectly summed up in this story of Wile E. Coyote chasing this bird in his futile attempt. Day after day, year after year, always trying to capture this bird. And so you can probably imagine it, little Sam and his bright, mismatched PJs, because it was the early 90s, so that's what we were doing on a Saturday morning, up early to watch Cartoon Connection, Saturday Disney, bowl of Wheat Bix smothered in sugar, settled on the couch, learning the deepest lessons of the human psyche from Wile E. Coyote as he chased this bird over and over again, never to catch it. See, as I said, day after day, he'd pursue Roadrunner. Each day he would fail, and then we'd try again. I added it up. So the show ran for 17 years. I really went way too deep into this analogy. But the show ran for 17 years. So if we actually extrapolate that out and assume that this was a daily occurrence, because more than likely it was, that's over 6,000 attempts that he had on Roadrunner's life never to be successful. You got to give it to him. He had a purpose and a mission. See, here's the object of his desire. The object of his dream was to catch this bird. And his actual whole identity was caught up in this singular focus. This is the thing. He's decided that this is what is going to make me happy. And yet year after year, he continues to do the same thing. And every time he gets close, every time He almost achieves his dream, right? Something stops him. Something gets in the way and prevents him from getting the thing that he desires. I mean, if we think about it, what's he to do? He's got a couple of options, right? Like, he could give up, of course. He could sit down one day and say, "No, I'm done. I'm done. This is ridiculous. I have wasted 17 years of my life on this. I'm just going to let this bird go. I'm going to go get a job, go flip burgers or whatever, and try something else. Like, what can I do? I can't catch this bird." But the problem that he would face, and I think this is one we can relate to when we've sewn our identity around something, is that you can't simply give up. See, he'd always think, well, what if I could catch that bird? Then I'd be happy. He'd be giving up on the one thing that he desired the most. On the flip side, there's the possibility that one day he does eventually catch it. But you'd almost have to imagine that after 17 years, it would kind of be this little bit of an anticlimax. Like, I've never eaten Roadrunner, I've tried emu, and I've had ostrich, and I can tell you, I don't think there's any meal in the world that would be worth 17 years of your life. And so there's this problem of, I think it would really let you down. But at the same time, he's also faced with this existential problem of, I've done this 6,000 times. I've done this every day of my life for 17 years. What comes on the next day? What do you do when you've done something for 17 years and that's the only thing that you've cared about? And so, of course, there's this third option, which is to simply just keep chasing the bird and to hope that you never catch it. And I think that's actually what's happening with Wile E. Coyote. Because we think about it. I told you I went too deep into this analogy. You think about it. There is a purpose to this. You think about it. He gets all his equipment from this company called Acme, right? Like, seriously, this stuff's really dodgy. None of it works. Like, if you've seen any of these, you know none of it works. You can't tell me that that company continues to be in business when it is producing equipment that is this shoddy. Like, there's just no way. Catapults that slam you into the ground, ropes that break, black paint that you can paint on the wall, but the Roadrunner can run straight through it, but as soon as you try to follow, you slam into the wall. Like, this is dodgy equipment. And so they don't tell you this. You don't see any of this, but I'm convinced of it. I think there's only one reasonable explanation, and that's simply that Roadrunner is sabotaging his own equipment. See, because Acme would never get away with producing equipment that rubbish. So he must be self-sabotaging. I don't think he wants to catch the bird. See, when you look at those three options he's faced with, he can catch the bird or he can give up. But both of those options come at the cost of something, his identity. And then he would actually have to change. He has to face the realization of, well, what else do I have? What comes next? He spent 17 years chasing this bird. What would he even do? Now, the easiest thing for him to do is to keep going through the cycle, is to keep chasing the bird, but never to catch it, and to live in the comfort of his own discomfort. And of course, it's really funny to think about this in the context of a cartoon, right? But in how many ways is this not similar to our own circumstances? Because in how many ways isn't this what we do? How often are there times and moments and areas in our life where we hold back or where we push away, where we keep at arm's length the very thing that we actually want the most? Because it's more comfortable to live in the idea of something than the discomfort of stepping into the moment and allowing God to transform us from who we were into who He always intended us to be. See, Paul puts it this way in Romans 7:15, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, that I do. How many of us can relate to this? In the areas of our own lives, when we think about our relationships with others, when we think about our relationship with God. We know what we need to do. We know what will bring us closer to God, to fulfilling our potential, and yet so often we actually do the opposite. So this realization kind of hit me a little bit recently when I was talking to a friend of mine, and they'd been telling me about they'd been playing some sport and they'd injured their back, and they didn't really know what was wrong, and it was a bit of a niggle. It was painful, but it wasn't enough to warrant them. They were tough and they were macho, so they were just going to tough it out, and surely it would kind of rectify itself. And he was telling me that this actually went on for months, and during that period, he was really, really annoying to be around, let's be honest, because he complained a lot. He complained a lot and a lot and a lot, and his back actually never got better. Until finally one day, he was telling me this, that his brother actually called him on it and said, do you even want to be better? I think you just want to complain. Because he hadn't gone to a doctor, he hadn't gone to a physio, he hadn't gone to a chiro. He just wanted to complain and complain and complain about the situation. And it was really, really, it really hit him in that moment that he realized that he'd actually kind of loved the sympathy. And he kind of loved the attention and the excuse. See, he thought he wanted healing. He was telling me this. He thought he wanted healing, but he didn't realize all the while he'd actually been satisfied to sit in a place of his pain and brokenness that he never needed to stay in. See, he eventually went to the physio and he got a few small stretches and exercises, and within a week he was fine. And if he'd done that at the beginning, it all would have all been over in a week, but instead he waited months, and so he sat in that place that he never needed to stay in. And so I kind of wanted to kick off with those stories this morning to provide a framework of what I want to talk about today, kind of as that jolting moment for all of us, because I think it can be so easy for us to find ourselves in this place that when life happens, and it will happen, that the temptation exists to settle in our own discomfort, to stay in a place that we're never meant to stay. That sometimes the thing that is actually holding us back in our own lives is ourselves. And that when the most comfortable choice seems to pull us back or push us away or keep us at arm distance, when the most comfortable choice actually seems to be to self-sabotage and to keep others at arm's length, I want to remind us that life is not a series of events that is happening to us, but a series of moments that we're waiting for us to step into. That God has given you the power to choose, and that we never drift into anything worthwhile, that God has already made the choices that opened up the future for you, but those moments are waiting for you to step into and to choose them. So there's two moments I kind of want to share this morning. And I want to contrast the two, because in one example we see people lean into God, and then in the other example we see them pull away. And the first story happens in the book of Exodus. And it's the story of the Israelites. And if you're familiar with the story, what happens is that the Israelites have gone into Egypt, and that was actually a blessing of God, a moment of salvation, of providence, where they'd been facing a famine in the land, and God had miraculously led them into Egypt through Joseph and provided for them. But after 430 years, the situation had changed, and for a vast amount of that time, they'd actually been in slavery and captivity. And so as the account unfolds, we find this story of God coming to rescue his people out of this situation. It's a story of God's power and his deliverance for his people from their oppressors, and this incredible example of how God is always there calling his people out of their circumstances and into something new, but out of what held them in captivity and into intimacy with him, which is still the same for us today. So that's kind of the scene where we find ourselves, and I want I want to read Exodus 7:16 because what we find here is that God has tasked Moses with this job of going and talking to Pharaoh. And so we see Moses saying to Pharaoh, "The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness." That's the part I want you to catch onto today, so that they may worship me in the wilderness. See, a little bit of a sidebar here. It's interesting that when we so often tell this story, we kind of think that God is calling the Israelites out of Egypt and into the promised land, that they're going straight from captivity in Egypt into this land that they're going to possess, but it's actually not the case, because he's actually calling them into the wilderness to worship him, to have relationship with him, to have communion with him. And so it's this interesting concept that what we see is, while the promise of God might always be in the future, and that's the promised land in this case, God doesn't call you to the promise, he's always calling you to himself. And so if there's something in your life that you've been chasing and it's not taking you to God, it's actually probably not of God. Another really interesting side point is the dynamic here that I want to point out, and it's this: sometimes in life we find ourselves in a situation of doing a thing that at one time had been exactly where God had led us, and that was Egypt for the Israelites. At one point in time, God had led them in. But it was for a specific time and for a specific season. And the risk that we can find is that we think that God is in the thing. And so we try and hold on to the thing and not onto God. And the very thing that at one time had become a blessing can actually become the very thing that holds us captive. And so that was all sidebar. And so we go back to the book of Exodus and we read about the miraculous signs and wonders that God performs in Egypt to liberate his people. So Moses has gone to Pharaoh and said, let them free. And we know the story that Pharaoh, his heart is hardened and he doesn't. And then we find over and over and over again, time and time again, God provides these miraculous signs. In Exodus 7, we see the staff turning to a snake. In Exodus 7 to 11, we read about the plagues of Egypt. Then in Exodus 14, as they're leaving, we see the parting of the Red Sea and the deliverance from Pharaoh's army, God miraculously providing food for them to eat in the desert, springs bursting forth from rocks so that they had water. All of these things, all of these miraculous signs they witness on their way to Sinai to meet with God. On their way to Sinai to worship with him. And in fact, verse 17 tells us when they get to Sinai, the very presence of God descends on the mountain like a cloud. They're camped around the base, and the very presence of God descends on the mountain around them. Now, keep in mind that the Israelites haven't been able to worship God for 400 years. They haven't been free for 400 years. And not only are they free now, but they're invited into the very presence of God. What a triumphant moment that must have been. What a moment of excitement and worship and praise and exaltation. We take a look at Exodus 20:18. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the smoke on the mountain, they trembled with fear. And the really heartbreaking part, they stayed at a distance. And so what we see in this story as we keep reading is that God invites them into this moment. God is calling them out into Sinai to have relationship with him. He invites them into this moment of intimacy. This moment where he's saying, I want to take you from where you were into where I've always planned you to be. A future that's bigger than the one that they had for themselves. But instead of stepping in, they held back. Instead of embracing the moment, they backed away. They chose to stay at arm's length, to stay in the comfortable, in their own discomfort. See, all throughout the journey to Egypt, despite all the incredible things that they witnessed, despite all that they knew to be true, we actually find this really interesting dynamic happening every time they kind of came up against some kind of confrontation or some kind of obstacle. And so we see that when Pharaoh's army came out, they cried out, it would have been better for us back in Egypt. We see that they get hungry. They cried out, it would have been better for us back in Egypt. When they get thirsty, it was so much better for us back in Egypt. Despite who they knew God to be, they had this response that it was better back in Egypt. And when the moment finally came at Sinai to be in the presence of God, they pulled back, caught in the idea of, but unable to step into what God had for them. See, it's easy to look at this story and think, wow, what an opportunity. I don't understand. I don't get it. How could they do that? And yet, there are moments in our lives when God is calling us closer, when he's inviting into a deeper relationship with him, but we stay back. We hesitate because we're afraid of what might change if we get too close. We're afraid of what he might ask us to give up or where he might lead us, so we keep our distance. And I had a friend that for years and years, they barely came to church. They'd been hurt, and you kind of would look at their life and you'd go, yeah, I get that. Like that's some pretty deep stuff, and I get why you're hurt, but they would really be sporadic with church. If they came, it would kind of be really hit and miss. And I talked to them a few times about this, and the response was actually always the same. It's like, yeah, but see, I know what God's going to ask me, and I'm not ready to give that up yet. And so instead of coming to church, they distanced themselves. Instead of coming to God with their pain, they distanced themselves because they weren't willing to let go of that pain. The exciting thing out of all of that is that God didn't call us to live lives of mediocrity. He didn't create us to live in a perpetual state of almost, but never quite. He calls us to fullness of life. He calls us to step out in faith, to trust him completely, to follow him wholeheartedly. And in John 10:10, Jesus says, I've come that you may have life and life to the full. Fullness of life isn't found in staying in our comfort zones. It's found in the stepping out, in pursuing him, in letting go of our fears and our doubts and our need for control, and realizing that he's so much bigger than we knew. It's about trusting him even when we don't know what's next, because he does. It's about believing that his plans for us are good, that he is faithful, that he is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask. Hey, so the second story, and I want to share it briefly because I'm conscious of time, but it actually takes place only a generation after this story. And it centers around this woman named Rahab. And it's this story about how Rahab, who was an outsider, who wasn't part of the Israelites, made a positive choice to step out of her circumstances, to step out of her past, out of the things in her life that were holding her back, and to step into a moment, into a defining moment with God. How that defining moment with God redefined her entire future and the future of generations and generations to come. See, the story is set as the Israelites, they'd left Israel, they'd left Sinai, and they're about to go actually into the promised land. And it's a whole generation later. The land that God had promised them. But the problem was that within that land were the armies of the Canaanites. And they had to conquer these armies. And there was a whole range of cities, and we probably know the story, but there was this city called Jericho, which was a major fortress. It was unbeatable, unscalable. And in this city was this woman named Rahab. And she was actually known as Rahab the prostitute. That was her full title. See, she was actually defined by her profession. She was defined by the worst thing that she had actually ever done. The worst choice that she'd ever made was the very thing that defined her. But as history would have it, some of the Israelites were on a reconnaissance mission, and so they had to infiltrate the city. And they happened to infiltrate the city through Rahab's house, and they found themselves in Rahab's house, but then they were discovered. And at that point, she had a choice. See, as a prostitute who was considered an outcast and the lowest of the lows, in a city that was the enemy of God, she had a choice to either continue in her life a life of loneliness and of shame, or to draw a line in the sand and to make that moment a defining moment in her life. See, Rahab had every reason to pull back. She had every reason to make excuses, to say, I'm not good enough. But instead, she actually turned to these men and she said, I want to be on God's side. I know that your God is the real God. I know what's going to happen to this city, and I know who you are. So I want to be on God's side. Will you accept me? And in that moment, what we find is that Rahab's life was redefined, and she became an instrument. She actually became an instrument in the story of God's salvation for her and her family, an instrument of God's purpose and of his redemption. See, can you imagine Rahab the prostitute, who would have been shunned by her family? They would have been ashamed of her. She would have brought shame on them. But Rahab the prostitute becoming Rahab the deliverer. She was able to go to her family, to those who were filled with shame and disgust for her choices in her life, and say, come under my roof, come into my house, for it's in my house that you'll find life and safety. So you think that Rahab would be the last person in the world that God would choose. But the amazing thing about God is that it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. God will use anyone. He'll take anyone whenever you're ready to step into his presence, whenever you're ready to follow him. If you say, God, I want you, he lets us step into that new definition of ourselves. And in this moment where Rahab the prostitute became Rahab the redeemer, it reminds us that we are only ever one choice away from a new life and a new future. See, God gives us the ability to choose, to not be defined by moments, but to step into moments and define them. Just as your life today might be a product of some of the choices of your past, so your future will be the product of the choices you make today. See, for some, that means that you do have choices to make today. You've been ignoring God for so long. You've been angry with God. You've been angry with yourself for something that happened in your life. And you've been limping along with the weight of these choices, carrying them on the back. And you figure this is just how it is now. But God says that's not so. See, for some of us today, the decision we have to make is the decision to just make a fresh choice, a fresh start. Deciding to walk away from the choices of the past and start anew. Forgiving God for the consequences of your own actions. And for some of you, that means forgiving yourself. For some means walking away from destructive patterns and habits and the choices in your life. Those moments where we self-sabotage because it's easier to live in our discomfort than to step into the new. See, it's never too late to choose. You have the power to choose each and every day. It's never too late to step into a moment and make it a defining moment in your life going forward. See, and finally, for some people here, the choice to make today might be the first step. It might be the next step, but it might be the first step. So I'm going to ask everyone in a moment just to bow your heads and close your eyes. See, some of us today have never made that decision to follow Jesus, this God we talk about. You may not really know who he is yet, but you want to know him. And you know he loves you. The God who loves you so very much that he gave everything to save you, that he wants to have this relationship with you. The God that says you're not defined by your past, that loves you so much that he's already made the choices that open up a future for you. That each and every moment is an invitation waiting for you to step into and to choose. And so if this is you this morning, while every eye is closed and heads are bowed, I just want to give you that opportunity to say yes to God. To say, God, I'm giving you my life. And so the way that we do that here is I'm simply going to pray. And just as we're praying, what I'm going to ask is that if you're making that choice for the first time, or you're saying, no, God, I need to come back to you, I need to make that choice afresh today, I'm going to ask that you simply slip up your hand this morning. Not to embarrass you, not to call you out, just simply as an outward decision of that inward, an outward expression of that inward decision. And so if that's you this morning, we're not going to go on for much longer, but if that's you, would you like to slip up your hand this morning? If you're saying, God, I need to come back to you. God, I want to know you this morning. That's awesome. That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'm just going to pray for those people that raised their hands this morning. And if you didn't raise your hand but you wanted to, or there was something going on inside where you're like, God, I know that's me. I know I've been away, but I want to come back. Then can you just pray this prayer with me as well? See, Father, I thank you that you so loved me, that you died for me. In this moment, I'm pressing into you. I'm saying today is a new day. I choose you, God. I'm giving my life to you. Help me to lay down the things of me. In Jesus' name, amen.
We hope you enjoyed today's message. And if it did impact you and you did give your life to Christ today, we would love to hear from you and be able to help you on this next stage of your journey. So send us a message on Facebook or Instagram or by the website so that we can connect with you and start the process with you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.